Welcome to episode 4 of Scoliosis Dialogues. I'm your host, Cynthia Nguyen from Shriners Hospital in Pasadena, and I'm a candidate active SRS member.
And I'm your co-host, John Vorhies, a candidate active member of SRS from Stanford.
This episode is a continuation of our series on highlights from the virtual SRS Annual Meeting. For this edition, we chose the topic of skeletal maturity assessment, which is a topic vitally important to all of us who treat scoliosis in growing patients. This year's meeting included multiple great presentations and posters dealing with this topic, and it was really hard to narrow it down. But eventually, after much discussion, we decided to highlight the particularly interesting and innovative work of Dr. Brian Smith from Texas Children's Hospital and Dr. Michelle Welborn from Shriners Hospital in Portland.
And after these two interviews, we've invited Dr. Jim Sanders from UNC to chat with us and provide some expert commentary about the current state of research into growth and skeletal maturity as it relates to scoliosis. To get things started, we'll begin by discussing some recent work of Dr. Brian Smith from Texas Children's Hospital in Houston. Dr. Smith and colleagues have been working for several years to develop a radiographic classification system for the proximal humerus physis that correlates with growth velocity and other measures of skeletal maturity. At SRS this year, he presented some work that his group has done to refine the classification to include the medial half of the physis, which helps to more accurately define the timing of peak height velocity. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Smith.
It's nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. We are going to ask you a few questions about your recent paper and your work in the proximal humerus in general, and then just a little bit about you as well. I wanted to start by just asking you a little bit about your history and how you got into orthopedics and got to where you are today.
That's a long time ago in my case, but I was a medical student at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and then was fortunate to do my residency there in orthopedics. I was in a class of over 200 students. Literally 38 of us went into orthopedics, so it's an orthopedic factory. When we did our third-year rotations, it was just the most enjoyable and fun rotation that we all had. Just the ability to really influence patients' lives is incredible in such a positive way. You know, the academy talks about getting them back in the game or getting them going again, but that's really true to enable people to move on with their lives and maintain their lifestyle and their activity level. So it's just, you know, I tell medical students now, we're blessed to be in the best profession in orthopedics, and the vast majority of orthopedic surgeons, I think, are grateful for their ability to do what they do.
Great, thanks. And you mentioned a few people, but are there any major mentors within the SRS or orthopedics that got you to where you are or helped you get where you are?
Well, I would certainly start with my dad, who was in medicine. He was an obstetrician. I was not too interested in following his footsteps, but he was always a mentor to me and supportive. Ironically, my dad went to Georgetown Med School. I did, and my son did too. So we had a special reunion or gathering at my son's white coat ceremony when we had 3 generations of Georgetown Med students there. And we had a nice event with the dean and so forth. So, but my family was influential. Once I was at Georgetown, there was really a seminal individual there that everyone knows. Just saying his last name, Delahaye. Everyone knows Delahaye, but he impressed me, and I tried to model myself after him in a way, because Jack Delahaye was brilliant. He was from an era when, as he would say, the dumbest guys in the class would go into orthopedics, but he happened to be first in his class, both at Georgetown as an undergrad and then in the medical school. And so he was a brilliant orthopedic surgeon who just was in private practice, but donated several days a week to teaching both medical students and residents. So Jack Delahaye, I think, influenced many generations of Georgetown students and residents. He was never a program chairman. He was always in the background, but he certainly was an influential person in my life. And it really directed me more towards pediatric orthopedics, which was his subspecialty, although he didn't do a fellowship.
Great. Was your dad disappointed you didn't go into OBGYN?
Not necessarily. His only advice was don't go into psychiatry. He thought it was a waste of a medical degree, but that's his opinion.
My dad was an internist, and he told me medicine was great and I should do anything I wanted to except for internal medicine. Okay, great. So why don't we shift gears a little bit, and I'll ask you a few questions about your work in the proximal humerus. The proximal humerus has been staring us scoliosis surgeons in the face for as long as they've been taking x-rays of the spine. What led you to think about looking at this to try to define skeletal maturity better?
Well, you know, and you've interviewed Jim Sanders, who's really, I think, the leader in assessing skeletal maturity in these adolescent kids and helping us understand how their age physiologically impacts the risk of progression of scoliosis. We're all indebted to his work on the hand. And, I was also influenced by Jack Flynn, presented a paper maybe at the 2017 or 2016 SRS meeting about using the EOS and trying to get the hands up and trying to see if you could do a Sanders hand assessment off the EOS film by having the hands up. And they presented a paper on that. And that led me to believe, is there anything else we could look at on the radiograph that would help us with a guide to maturity? And most of the time, one of the shoulders is there on most radiographs. And as you say, I think I said when I presented one of these papers at the SRS that it's been staring us in the face all these years. And then through, the great access that Dan Cooperman has to the Bolton Brush collection, the Heyman Todd collection, osteologic collections through the Cleveland History of Natural History Museum of Cleveland, I guess, Museum of Natural History. They have such great access to osteological collections. We were able to start looking at the physis and seeing how it matures, and realize that it matures from medial to lateral. We know that each physis matures a little bit differently in the body. We analyzed a number of radiographs of histologic patients that were in that histologic study, where they have x-rays of most of their body every year of their lives, and they know exactly their height and weight, and we're following. So you can really tell in this population, the Bolton Brush group, exactly when they had their peak height velocity and their rate of growth. And we were able to put together, with Dan's support and some really brilliant medical students at Yale, the evolution of the physis and its maturity. And then we looked at a series of my patients, having been there over a decade, that we knew outcomes in, whether they had been braced or not, or just followed what their outcomes were, and whether they had reached the surgical threshold. So we were able to correlate our system with their clinical information, and that was the focus of our first work and our first paper. We've been really fortunate and really almost blessed in a way, because I've presented this material now at 3 SRS meetings in a row from the podium, which is a real honor to be able to select. And of course, in 2019, we won the Hibbs Award as the best clinical paper. So again, one of the highlights of my life. But it was just me staring at some x-rays and realizing, we can see that growth plate. It's an interesting growth plate, the shape of it, and just thinking about how does it mature and what can it tell us about maturity, and can it be more accurate than the Rister sign? Jim Sanders has taught us that the peak height velocity is already done by the time a patient is Rister 1. So it's really helpful in looking at even younger kids and understanding where their growth is and how mature they are. It's been a fun ride, and we're learning more about it every day.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Yeah, I was fortunate. Just a creative thought came to my mind of, why don't we really look at the humerus? And I was in the right place in the right time, and had Dan Cooperman as my partner, so we could really go back and look at this osteologic collection, and then come up with a staging system or a scheme or our phases of growth for that, the system itself, and then apply that to a clinical collection of patients that we knew the outcomes of. So it really came together, and it was really a team effort.
So how are you using this in your practice now, and how is it being used to your knowledge?
I use it every day that I'm seeing patients in the office, and it really gives me, obviously I look at the Rister sign, and I've asked our radiology team where I work at the main campus, we have the EOS machine, but we're having the kids stand just a little asymmetrically, so we get one shoulder anyway. And we've tried to pilot a positioning system where the hands are just anterior to the thighs. In theory, you could still look at the hands and maybe discern Jim Sanders' system. It doesn't obscure the spine on the lateral view, because with EOS, we're getting usually a PA in the lateral. And we worked with our radiologists to try to make sure that we're not obscuring anything they want to look at. But having the shoulder sort of not in full, at the side of the body, but just even flexed gently, still gives us a good view of the physis of the humerus. And I use it to help guide my treatment. In Houston, we see a lot of kids that are of Hispanic background, and they tend to mature earlier. So it's sort of reassuring to see that they're fairly mature, even if they're a 12-year-old girl and they're already stage 3 or stage 4. We redefined actually stage 3 a little bit, because we've added in looking at the medial aspect of the physis. Originally, our work was focused on the lateral margin, because we were worried that the medial side would not be seen well and would be obscured by the glenoid. So we thought that would be more confusing. But stage 3 in our system is a little bit broad, and what we've realized is that the medial physis starts to close down and thin out earlier as the physis closes from medial to lateral. So we've sort of divided stage 3 into 3A and 3B, where 3A, it's wide open still. 3B, it's really thinning down, almost closed, but it's still too wide laterally to be truly a stage 4. we've added a stage in there, divided up the stage 3 into medial open or medial closed, which has helped further refine our staging and our assessment of maturity. It's interesting. Some of my partners, as I see their notes now, they'll refer to it. Sometimes they call it the Smith staging system, but sometimes they call it FOSS, proximal humerus ossification system, or just the shoulder score, and they'll put that in their notes too. Several of my partners use it very frequently because it's in all their notes. So that's very gratifying. I don't know if other people across the country are using it, but I've heard some feedback that people are certainly looking at it and trying to add it to their repertoire of what they look like to assess maturity.
So it sounds like it's entirely validated in regular X-rays, but you're using it with EOS. Is that correct?
Correct. And trying to make sure that we have the arms positioned accordingly.
For a lot of centers now, we're lucky enough to have an EOS machine. Is there any concern about the image quality dropping in the EOS machine and validating that with plain films?
It's a good question. And, some people have asked about doing that study and comparing plain films to the EOS, but we have one EOS machine at our med center, which is where I see a lot of my patients. And I've been looking at those images now for, a year and a half, almost 2 years. I think I can really see quite well. It really depends on the position of the humerus. Sometimes they were getting the kids with their arms flexed forward too much, and then you're really out of the plane of the AP mode. In that case, then you can't really render a good assessment of the proximal humeral physis. It's a little bit more challenging. And that's why, as John was saying, we're really trying to standardize the position of the arms, get the hands just in front of the thighs so that the humerus doesn't obscure on the lateral view the thoracic spine. And it is a little tricky because, the kids are hypokyphotic. So the humerus, just getting it in front. We think that we can still see what we need to see on the humerus, the physis, and especially the lateral margin of the epiphysis relative to the metaphysis, which is in the early stages what we're really looking at. I think we can see that still pretty well in the EOS machine, but it is tricky, and it takes, the average EOS might narrow down and give you not enough of either shoulder. So literally, they're having the kids stand like maybe 6 inches off center just to get one shoulder in. So our x-rays are looking a little different because they almost have the whole arm and then the spine, but they don't see the other, you just barely see the rest of the chest on the far side.
And at our Shriners Hospital, we're lucky and we're blessed with really awesome radiology techs who transitioned pretty quickly to doing the 2-for-1, the Jacqueline 2-for-1 when that came out. But what advice do you have for folks who are at other centers who may have trouble adapting to new positioning of patients during these EOS films? Like what would be like kind of a list of advice you might give those radiology techs and that radiology department on the best way to position the arm for the FOSS system?
Well, what I did is first talk to our director of radiology, at least our musculoskeletal director of radiology at our center. I didn't talk to the surgeon, the radiologist in chief, but our MSK leader. And he was very, willing to embrace this and look at it. And he has the biggest influence on, the technique of x-rays throughout the system. And we had some papers come out. We've had a paper in JPO. We've had a paper in JBGS. We just have another paper submitted to the deformity journal of the SRS, spine deformity, which we hope will be approved. So we've published that. And with our 2 papers, I could give Herman Kahn as our chief of pediatric musculoskeletal radiology. I gave Herman our 2 papers, and it helped to say, Herman, this was the best paper for clinical papers at the 2019 SRS meeting. So that was a little bit of a feather in our cap. So that was the Montreal meeting. And then what I did, at least where I'm working mostly, is I actually took the paper, and we have some better handouts of the staging system that one of my partners even blew up and made for us. And we gave those to the technicians so they can understand what we're looking for. And the director of radiology, or the unit director, was very forthcoming, and she really changed how the EOS were done. And even in the static standard films, we try to make sure that we can see a shoulder. I think it's just educating the team, reaching out to them. We're trying to do the right thing for the patients, and as much information as we can extract from the film, that's ideal for the patient and helps guide our treatment decision making.
Great. Is there a time now when you are sending a patient back for a hand x-ray, or do you feel like you have enough information with a properly positioned humerus, you don't really need it anymore?
Well, quite honestly, I hate to say this because I don't want to, alienate my friend Jim Sanders, who, has been so instrumental in as a colleague working on this project. But I don't send kids for as many hand films as I used to because I feel I can get, if I have a good shoulder X-ray, I feel I'm pretty good knowing what their maturity is based on that. And again, we all add in other things like their menstrual history, and we can look at their growth rate and so forth. But for me, it's really cut down the number of hand films I do, for sure.
Did you have anything else you wanted to mention?
No, but thank you for thinking of me in this project. And, I think this is a great format, and hopefully it was helpful. Yeah, I'm just honored to be chosen to talk about it.
Our next guest is Michelle Welborn from Shriners Hospital in Portland. We're really happy to have her join us to talk about how she got started in spine surgery and ortho, as well as to discuss her groundbreaking research on using collagen X or collagen 10 as a biomarker for skeletal maturity assessment. She has won multiple prestigious grants for this research, as well as the 2019 Thomas E. Whitecloud Award, which honors the best basic science research at the IMASC. So we feel very fortunate to have her join us today. Hi, Michelle. Good morning. Thanks for being part of episode 4 of Scoliosis Dialogues.
Thanks so much for having me, Cynthia.
All right. This episode is delving into skeletal maturity assessment, and it's also part of the highlights from SRS 2020 series. And so as soon as John and I came up with our theme idea, skeletal maturity assessment, we thought of you and your awesome research. So we're very happy to talk about that. But before we kind of delve into that, we also want to get to know the person behind the research. So what got you interested in orthopedic surgery to begin with?
So that was blackmail. Yeah. So I actually did not know what orthopedics was when I went to medical school. I actually really wanted to do international aid work, and I had been working in the third world for quite a long time before going into medicine. And so that was my principal interest. And when I got to medical school, I was paired with a mentor who many people in the pediatric orthopedic world may know, Ned Schwenker, who is a really incredible guy who spent his life working in the third world. And he just knew. He convinced me to go to an orthopedics interest group meeting, even though I didn't know what it was. And when I was there, he actually nominated me to be president of the interest group, even though, again, I did not know what orthopedics actually was. Since he was the group advisor, I was unanimously voted in. And I spent the next year learning all about orthopedics, and I was hooked. So he apparently does this a lot, and I'm the only time he was ever successful in picking. But it was all because of Ned Schwenker and him taking an interest in me and really kind of pointing me in this direction.
Awesome. Why specifically pediatric spine surgery?
So actually my grandfather was a quad. He had an injury when my mom was pretty young. And so actually spine has always really interested me, and kind of, just how that brain-body connection just early on really, really interested me. And so when I went to college, I studied molecular cellular biology, but specifically neurobiology, and then also psychology, just trying to better understand all of that. And so when I went into medical school, that was already an interest. With spine surgery, it's just, you've got this incredible opportunity to be there at a really tough point in people's lives. It is something that defines many people's lives, and you can make it a positive experience. And so I think that's one of the biggest things is that, especially because I have a particular interest in early onset scoliosis, I get to watch these kids grow up. I get to be a part of their lives for many years. And again, trying to give this to them as a source of strength, and to help reframe their perspective has been really, really a wonderful opportunity for me.
Who are some of your mentors in spine surgery and in ortho in general?
Yeah. Oh God, I am really blessed. So kind of early on, I just was like this pesky person. I remember I would meet somebody one time at a conference, and I would go up to them again and be like, "Hey, I'm Michelle. Remember me?" And they wouldn't. And like the 5th time I did that, they would. And then like the 10th time, they'd like grudgingly like say hello. now they are all friends. But, the people that have influenced me the most have really been people like Sukin Shah, who is just an incredible mentor for so many people. I mean, that's one of the first things that I think of when I think of him. Bert Yazzie has really gone out of his way to be a good friend and mentor to me. Amr Samdani is like my constant cheerleader. Brian Snyder, I can't say enough good things about that guy. And our late night dinners at SRS, where we stay up until 2:00 in the morning, nerding out, talking about science. And, Jim Sanders has just been a perpetual source of, support and, guidance. And George Thompson, who probably has mentored you as well, just I get these weekend phone calls because he wants to tell me something. Thanks, George. He's just such an incredible friend and mentor. And he's just, I've learned so much from all of these people. And, there's so many more people. I can't, count all of them. Obviously, early people like Ned Schwinker who got me on this path. But I've been really blessed to have a lot of wonderful people in my life who help and guide my path, who, kind of lift you up and then also keep you grounded.
That's awesome. One of the cool things about listening to a lot of these podcast episodes have been when people get asked about who their mentors are, it's just incredible how many people, they're able to just list off, because there are so many great orthopedic surgeons out there who are great educators and just fantastic mentors. And so that's one of my favorite questions when it comes to these episodes.
I mean, that was the short list,
Yeah.
Part of why I love scoliosis and I love early onset so much is because the plethora of mentors. It is such an incredibly welcoming community, and really the people just kind of open your arms. I mean, I can't even talk about there's so many more people on that list.
Okay, moving on to your research about collagen 10, which I've been calling collagen X in my head. Is it collagen 10, 10 collagen, or collagen X?
So technically it's collagen 10, but we refer to the biomarker as CXM. So I think you can say either one, but if you're looking for, your exam question, because collagen 10 actually does show up on the in-training exam, it's collagen 10. But it's symbolized with the Roman numeral X.
Okay, sweet, collagen 10. Well, how did you first get into the research on collagen 10?
Yeah. So again, one of those lucky opportunities. So for those that don't know the backstory, basically collagen 10 is one of the types of collagen that's in the physis. And it is there, basically the process of enchondral ossification and turning soft bone into hard bone. And in that degradation process, it's released. Well, my partner, Mike Sussman, who some people might know, who's a pediatric orthopedic surgeon, he actually helped to discover this back in the early 80s. And so he was one of the people that delineated structure. And then subsequently, one of our other partners, William Horton, who is actually one of the people that figured out what Marfan's was and the genetic structure for that. He's a geneticist. He then spent a decade delineating its structure, delineating its role in the physis and in enchondral ossification. And so there was an incredible amount of work that had been done before I even got to Portland. And when I got to Portland, they hadn't done any of the translational work. They'd had this great idea. They'd worked with some kids actually as a result of funding from the Gates Foundation, because they knew that this could identify growth and they weren't sure how to use it. And what Gates was interested in was he was doing a lot of refeeding programs in Africa. And so after famine, what would happen for anybody who's familiar with growth, if you're looking at anthropometric measurements, so height, right, and weight, there's a lag, and height can lag up to 6 months to get a reliable measurement. And change in height is one of the best measures of improving nutrition. So they wanted to do something that was going to be a more timely measure of that. So that's where they were when I got there. They knew that this could measure some degree of growth and they weren't sure what to do. And just conversation in the hallway one day, they're like, hey, what do you think we can do with this? And I was like, I know. That's kind of where it got started. It was just a conversation in the hallway.
So meet in the hallway, you have the light bulb idea. Well, I know exactly what we can use this biomarker for. What happened next?
Failure happened next. So to preface this, I was, 6 months into practice, and, I love research, but I would not have said that was my title back then. And so I discovered that if I wanted to do this, I needed money. And, as a resident, people kind of give you the money to do stuff. And when you're an attending, they don't. And that was a surprise. I wrote a grant, and I look back on that grant now, and it's so bad that my eyes bleed, I want to cry a little bit. It was bad. It was really bad. In fact, I got my scores back on the grant, and I got like 8s. And at the time, I knew it was like, 1 to 10, and I thought 8, oh, that's a great score. It's, I think, the lowest score they awarded any grant. So bad. Thankfully, I wrote more grants, and so I failed again. And the second time around, actually, Paul Sponsteller and Michelle Caird and some people on the Posner Research Committee decided to see beyond the bad grantsmanship to the concept, and they gave me some money, which I used to get the pilot data. And then because I demonstrated success, my program sent me to a grant writing workshop where I then discovered just how truly bad my grants were. And so at that point, I was able to use that grant writing workshop and my pilot data to write a much, much bigger grant. So we catalyzed the $10,000 into almost $700,000. That was really what enabled this much, much bigger study that we're kind of halfway through now.
As a young surgeon who's sitting on a pile of rejected grant applications, what advice do you have for someone like me on how to improve my grant writing and hopefully eventually get something other than a rejection?
Yeah, the best thing that I did was I joined grant committees. So I joined the research committees for Posner and for SRS. And I think that, that's one of the biggest tips I would give to anybody is think about what your passion is and then join a committee that reflects that. So, I know John's on that committee as well. You can sit there and you read these grants, and not only do you see what goes into a good grant, but then you hear the dialogue, you hear the conversation about what made that a good grant. So, listening to the inner workings of all these different reviewers' thoughts really that level of knowledge. I think you learn so much from that. So that really, really helped me a ton. And then, like I said, I went to an awesome grant writing workshop, and that taught me a ton. If you want to, you can get onto grants on a bigger level. You can work with the NIH. They're always looking for orthopedic reviewers. That's just a pretty big level commitment.
Awesome. Thanks. For your collagen 10 biomarker work, has there been any consideration of a patent or any legal protection in that view?
So they do have a patent so the way the patents work is that you file the initial patent and then you have X amount of time to kind of like finalize everything. So they've had patents that have been filed, and they're in the time frame where they're finalizing all the data. And so we're in that process right now. And some of our processes have been refined. And so we're kind of further refining the patents as well.
Awesome. Great to know. And what are the future directions now for the study?
Yeah, so right now we're writing up our growth cessation paper. So I think one of the earliest things that we can say conclusively is that this is probably the best measure of cessation of growth. What we've been able to find is actually that none of the radiographic markers correlate. There's been some papers that have previously shown research score, Sanders score, et cetera, really don't tell you when growth is done. And we've been able to see that as well with our patients. And we've also been able to see that kind of once the levels drop to a certain amount, there's no significant measurable growth. So we're doing that right now. And that's a clear-cut, easy time frame. The next thing that we're also working on is just even correlating axial and appendicular growth. Nobody's really conclusively established that the two of them are correlated. And I think that's really important because we base a lot of one on the other. And so if they aren't at the same time, that's really important to know when we're thinking about like some of these subtleties in terms of treatment protocols. So we're working on things like that. We're refining our reagents. We're working on CLIA certification, which is getting your lab certified for FDA approval. lot of technical stuff that I never thought I would do. So.
What's your prediction for when we can start using this as the new clinical standard?
It's probably going to be at least 3 years is what I'm thinking. The process of CLIA certification takes a while. Like I said, we're working on some of our reagents. So we love the reagents, but we don't necessarily love our partner with the reagents. So there's so much that goes into this and really building an infrastructure. And so probably 2 or 3 more years is what I would suspect.
Awesome. Well, we are certainly looking forward to seeing all the rest of the awesome research that's coming from you and your team, and hopefully 2 or 3 years when we have patients come into clinic, instead of relying on radiographic markers only, we can just have them get a little poke, get a little bit of blood, and then send it off and get the really more refined result.
Your work is awesome. It's really cool. And every time I hear you talk about it, I think of like 100 questions I want to ask you about it.
Rock on.
First of all, it's really great to hear you talk about grant rejection as a precursor to success. Many, people that are further along in their careers have told me that, but it's always hard to remember that when you're like looking at the big red rejection stamp.
Or the really like politely worded email, thank you for your submission. But, like, great, another one.
Yeah, if it leads with thank you, it's bad.
So I have a couple questions, like specifically and then in general. From hearing, you talk about this a couple of times, I'm trying to sort of work how I might use the test as it exists in my practice. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sort of thinking about it like CRP, like where the absolute value might not really matter. The trend is important. And when it goes down to 0, we can hang our hat on that. Does that kind of sum up how you think about it now?
So I think it's a little bit more than that. I actually think that's a great, that's probably what you're going to use for the average person. So yes, when it gets down below a certain one, clearly beneficial. And yes, the trend absolutely matters because that's going to tell you if it's going up or if it's going down. If it's going down, obviously we're past kind of our peak growth. But there's also some distinction in terms of absolute value. You're going to be able to tell who's tall and who's short. For those people that are tall, their numbers are significantly higher than the people that are going to be short. And I think of that in terms of like, what are going to be some of the cutoffs for, say, magic rod, like who needs a growing construct? Right now we talk about like, they're not going to grow that much more. They need however many inches for this to matter, right? And we're learning so much that the tweeners don't do well for that. And so this is probably going to help distinguish those borderline people, the kid who is 4'5", but their parent is 6 foot tall, right? Versus the 4'5" kid whose parent's 5'2". So this is, I think, going to help clarify some of that. And then also, we think about vertebral body tethering, right? What's the biggest problem with vertebral body tethering right now? It's that it's dialing in just the right amount of correction for that growth. And I think that, again, you can look at that value and you can tell. I think about 3 kids that I did who were all ascender stage 5. One kid grew 2 centimeters in the 6 months after her VBT, and she was like perfect. It was so pretty. One of them lost a centimeter, and that's just measurement error, but like she didn't grow at all. So she stayed right where I dialed her in. And one of them grew 6 centimeters in 6 months and way overcorrected. And so one of the biggest things that we're seeing is that skeletal maturity and growth potential are not the same thing. We are currently making our clinical decisions based upon skeletal maturity, but ultimately growth potential is what is going to matter way more, right? Again, it's going to differentiate the Marfan's kid from the achondroplast, right? Because they actually have similar trajectories and similar skeletal maturities. And that's obviously an extreme, but I think that this is going to help us to distinguish those. So you're right, the trends matter. You're right, the absolute value matters, or rather in terms of the bottom, but there will be some degree of this is going to help identify tall versus short, early bloomers versus late bloomers.
So unlike other measures of skeletal maturity, which might be able to place you on a timeline, this can also tell you how much you might hope to gain from the remainder of your timeline.
Yeah, it's going to give you a better idea of that because you can look at the absolute value under the curve.
So what is it actually directly proportional to? Is it like total physeal volume in the body? Is it the rate at which the cells in that physis are working to grow? I mean, how can I wrap my head around what we're actually...
Yeah, it's the rate of turnover. It's the rate of turnover of the physis. So the absolute volume doesn't really matter as much because the absolute volume also tends to be proportional to blood volume, right? So there's that dilutional effect. So it's more the rate of turnover because that's going to be different.
And another thing that I had a question about was the diurnal variation. You see a lot of variation in this test throughout a 24-hour cycle in a normal person, right?
Actually, not really. So some degree of diurnal variation, but that's one of the reasons why this is better than a lot of other ones, is that the amount of diurnal variation is less than, say, hormones, et cetera, which are just, I mean, they're all over the place. So what we do see is that there is some, and the least amount of diurnal variation occurs in the morning. And that's probably not just simply diurnal variation, but loading your joints the first time, right? And then releasing that. We do find that within the first 2 hours, you have the least amount of variation, and that's probably the best time to take it. But we did measure this in kids with diabetes who are doing finger sticks all the time, right? And we looked at the amount of variation in a 24-hour period. And so, yes, there is some, but it's actually not as much as you would think.
So what is the magnitude of like variation throughout a day versus the magnitude of variation throughout peak height velocity versus?
Yeah. So actually that's another really good question. And that varies. In those kids that are growing fast, the amount of variation actually increases. And in the kids that are growing slow, the amount of variation decreases dramatically. And so that's actually another way that we're looking at measuring the speed at which kids are growing. And that's why we take it every day, 3 days in a row, so that we can quantify that variation. If there is increased variation, they're growing faster, and decreased variation, they're growing slower.
The last thing I wanted to ask about was how this helps us understand spine growth versus extremity growth. How do I mix that in? Because my knees are making collagen 10, so are my vertebrae.
Yeah, so what we're doing right now is we wanted to collect a massive amount of data with this study, because when I designed this study, I didn't know if collagen 10 was going to work. I didn't know that it was going to be as good as it is. Actually, that's pretty cool. But so when I designed the study, I designed it thinking about what if the collagen 10 flops and I don't want to waste all this money. So we collect height, standing and sitting. We collect spine length, ulnar length, wingspan, the Sanders score, Rulick and Powell, Risser score, TOSI, which is thumb ossification composite index. Like basically every single measure I could possibly collect, I do. And I want to thank all of my co-researchers and the drudgery that they do to collect all of this data. Because again, if the biomarker wasn't successful, we wanted to make sure that this was useful and that, you know, all of these kids and all of the work that they're doing and the sacrifices that they're making were worthwhile. So that's how we're trying to use this to distinguish, because what we're finding is that the ulnar length and the wingspan weren't correlating this well. Now that we've got, you know, over 10,000 specimens, we can look at that in much better detail, see how the biomarker is correlating to axial versus appendicular growth. And when we're looking at the axial growth, we're looking at the radiographic measures of spine length. We're looking at it both a true spine length as well as a T1 S1 height. And I think that that's an important distinction, just because as the curve obviously gets bigger, T1 S1 becomes less reflective of their spine length. And so we're trying to make sure that we've got all of that, so that way we can have, you know, the cleanest data.
Great. Very cool work.
For your collagen 10 biomarker work, has there been any consideration of a patent or any legal protection in that view?
So they do have a patent that so the way that patents work is that you file the initial patent and then you have X amount of time to kind of like finalize everything. So they've had patents that have been filed, and they're in the time frame where they're finalizing all the data. And so, so we're in that process right now. And some of that is, some of our processes have been refined. And so we're kind of further refining the patents as well.
Awesome. Great to know.
So I wanted to ask you just to sort of talk a little bit about good research versus product development, because this is a conversation that I know happens a lot behind the scenes in grant funding committees, and anyone who's doing, very innovative research, coming up with a new test, new treatment, is going to come up with this conundrum at some point that you might have something that is marketable. And how do you sort of balance the inherent conflict that comes up in that situation?
So I think there's a couple things. One, because in my mind, you've asked two different questions. Potential for conflict. One, I blind myself completely to patient's biomarker. So I have absolutely no idea what they are. And that's because at this point, I would not want to make any decisions based on this. Somebody early on, when they saw the data and saw how excited I was about it, was like, oh, Theranos, right? And bad blood. Like, and I was like, we're both blondes, I get it, but like, no, So I really wanted to make sure that anything I do is by what our current gold standard is. So all of my clinical decision-making is made in exclusion of the biomarker. And until we really have that conclusive, massive amount of data, I won't personally make any decisions on that, even though I know statistically speaking, it's better than the other stuff I'm using, which kind of hurts a little bit, but I don't want to be biased. The other half of that question is the patent. So I'm at a shrine, and because I'm at a Shriners Hospital, we're a non-for-profit organization, we will not ultimately be the ones that, do that, right? We're not going to run a commercial lab and process specimens. What we'll do is we'll develop this to a point and either license it or sell that. And for a few reasons. One, we're just not set up for that. And then also because, again, we're a not-for-profit organization. I think being somebody who's really passionate, totally naive, and relatively idealistic, didn't even think about patents until I was about 2 years into this process. And then at that point, it was more like, oh God, this is hard. Like, how do you do this? And thankfully, I don't actually have to do much with that. And so, I think that people like Pat Cahill probably know a whole heck of a lot more about the patenting process than I do. And I'm grateful to keep it that way.
Thanks. No, it's just interesting to hear different people talk about how they wrestle with that in their minds, because so many of my mentors and orthopedic surgeons in general have many different kinds of conflicts, and it's somewhat inherent in our jobs and the way we make decisions. And often we don't get a lot of training about how to deal with that in research or in practice.
No, we really don't.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Michelle. We're really hoping to have you on future episodes. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks. Well, I really enjoyed being here, and thanks again for having me today.
Jim, what got you interested in orthopedic surgery to begin with?
Well, I struggled when I was in medical school trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I was going to go into public health and did not like internal medicine. And I actually spent a little bit of time with my dad, who was a member of the SRS. He passed away this past year, and saw what he was doing and thought, well, this might be fun. And then I did some rotations in medical school and thoroughly loved it. And then I did a rotation with Vern Tolo in peds ortho. And I decided that I had to do that. That was what my career was going to be. So that's how I got interested.
And I wonder if you might talk just a little bit about any mentors that you might have had, both within orthopedics or outside of orthopedics.
Yeah, the first is that my dad was an orthopedist. He passed away a little over a year ago. And my dad was one of the great humanitarians. He actually was one of the winners of the SRS Blount Award for the work that he did taking care of the indigent in South Texas along the Rio Grande border and in northern Mexico. And just a wonderful human being. And if you were to ask me who was my great mentor, I would say that it was my dad. But I feel incredibly fortunate to have learned from all kinds of wonderful people. And there are so many wonderful people in this field. The people that I trained with, whether during my residency, the people at Scottish Rite who were my mentors. When I was at Shriners Hospitals, I worked with some incredible people that have stuck with me to this day. And you can just start thinking around the senior people in pediatric orthopedics, whether it's Kay Wilkins or Perry Schonecker or Colin Mosley or Newt McCullough. All of these people were just incredibly great mentors for me. And you get to see wonderful leadership. The person who led me into peds ortho in the first place was Vern Tolo. These are just all high quality people that you continue to learn from. And the good thing though is now the people that are my mentors are actually my colleagues are the people who are my age, and I get to learn from them and see how things work. Medicine drives lots of good people to it, and picking up their examples is just such a wonderful thing to do.
And why specifically your landmark work in skeletal maturity assessment? Kind of what got you to that? What was your inspiration for that?
I was an intern in orthopedics in San Antonio, and Jean Dubasset came down and visited in San Antonio. He was doing a sabbatical, and he started talking about this thing he was investigating called the crankshaft phenomenon. I was enthralled with it, and I started thinking that there must be a way to figure out when it happens, when it doesn't happen, when is there enough growth. And so then I went and did my fellowship at Texas Scottish Rite, and Tony Herring encouraged me to continue it, and that led to some work there. And Steve Richards over time encouraged me to continue it, and it's its own level of area of research that just blossomed over time. It's been a whole lot of fun.
Can you tell us about any specific aha moments or just a specific example of what led you to your staging system during this time?
I had a study which was funded by the SRS, and it was a shotgun approach to trying to identify maturity markers that would work. And we followed girls with idiopathic scoliosis through their growth spurt. We looked at Tanner stages. We looked at estrogen levels. We pulled out all kinds of different things. And we looked at the Tanner-Whitehouse staging system, and I graphed the curve progression over time based upon the individual scoring of the digits. And the aha moment was when I saw that the curves massively took off when the digits were all capping. And that was the aha moment. And you go, okay, there's something here that I'd never seen before, and this is just fascinating. What's going on?
And so this involved you looking at just a huge database of x-rays, I'm guessing.
Mm-hmm. But, it was a huge database, but it wasn't until we started analyzing the data and you go, wow, they all take off at the same time. What's going on here? That was really fun.
That's awesome. And since you introduced your staging system and it's sort of become the clinical standard that all of us surgeons have been using, what does it feel like to hear your name talked about a lot, a standard staging system? Like, what does that feel like?
Well, I guess I'm not in trouble when it's said, which is nice. But, it's enjoyable. I've enjoyed doing the work. It's nice that the work actually seems to be standing the test of time. But it's also a lot of fun seeing other people. You mentioned a couple of other papers you're going to be discussing. And other people are taking this work and they're trying to figure out how to make it work too. So I think that there's going to be all kinds of wonderful things. It's nice to be part of it, but it's also nice to see it moving on too.
Along those same lines, I wanted to ask you your advice about sort of how to pick what directions to go early in your practice. You have done work in many different ways. And I think you're a good example of somebody who's made achievements in areas in orthopedics that aren't necessarily directly related. Your work in casting, your work in skeletal maturity, and your work in quality with POSNA. Mm-hmm. And so as a young orthopedist, it's sort of challenging sometimes to decide what to pursue and what not to pursue.
Mm-hmm. And you can sometimes get overwhelmed if you start saying yes to everything. And initially when you're doing it, I think the good thing about orthopedics is everything is interesting. And so you want to be taking part in everything. And some of them are going to bear fruit and some of them aren't. And at some point in your career, there will reach a point when you go, I can't do everything. And I have to focus a little more on the things that really matter to me in the end. And not that these other things don't matter, but they're good things for other people to be doing. The work with quality has been, to me, that's basic clinical science that all clinicians need to understand because it's the only way we make practice better and care for patients better. I've had a wonderful time treating early onset scoliosis. Growth has just been fascinating to me. So those have been really easy areas for me to keep on going because I just find them so interesting.
Earlier in this episode, we interviewed Michelle Welborn on her work on collagen 10. I was wondering if we can get your take on how you feel this is advancing the field of skeletal maturity assessment.
I think it's wonderful work. Type 10 collagen is one of the primary types of collagen that are unique to growth. And yes, you do see it in osteoarthritis, but not to the same degree that you see it there. And in our older studies, we did not have access to that. That's a newer finding that you do have these type 10 stable collagen biomarkers. And I think it gives us an awful lot of potential to analyze children as they're going through their growth spurt in a very different way from our standard maturity markers using the hand or the shoulder or whatever else we're going to be doing with it. And I love seeing that. And I think it's going to give us some answers that we're not able to find using skeletal maturity markers otherwise.
Yeah, it's certainly an awesome frontier to kind of move on to a different, to use a biomarker. So great. And also earlier in this episode, we interviewed Brian Smith about his proximal humerus staging system. And I was wondering if we can get your take on that as well.
Sure. What we found over time is that the major marker for children's growth is the timing of the peak height velocity when you're talking about adolescence. Any maturity marker, whether it's type 10 collagen or it's another skeletal maturity marker that you can identify, is likely to be tightly related to the timing relative to the peak height velocity. And that can give us good predictions about what's going on with spine growth, with limb growth, et cetera. The shoulder is nice because it's convenient and it's on the x-rays. It doesn't have as many growth centers as the hand or perhaps the hips would, but it's there and it gives us a lot of opportunities. I think one of the struggles that Brian has had is that there's some challenges with positioning of the shoulder for the x-rays. Brian actually wrote a grant for POSNA that was accepted, and our goal is to get through a number of the x-rays that have been done through Texas Scottish Rite and through Iowa and see if we can apply it and then hopefully get some good answers for how it actually applies to these larger databases that have given us really good evidence for bracing over time. So I think that there's a lot of potential there. There's the potential for any other skeletal maturity marker because they're all really tightly related to the timing of the peak height velocity.
In addition to the two advances that we've just discussed, what else on the horizon in this field do you feel is really contributing to it?
Cynthia, what I would say is that there are other maturity areas that people are beginning to investigate. People are starting to get higher quality maturity markers about the hip and about the knee. There's the other ones that have been done on the calcaneus. There are a lot of these areas that are really amenable to skeletal maturity. I think one of the fun things, though, over time is when artificial intelligence is actually able to read these and give us high reliability measurements of what's going on. It's going to allow us to do much larger studies, to be able to get good data. And people hopefully will ultimately be able to send in an x-ray that they are seeing on a patient right then and have it analyzed through a large database and tell them how much more growth they have, how much more their spine's going to grow. And hopefully we could take it even to the point of how much is your curve likely to worsen over the next year.
Yeah, and actually the field of AI is rapidly expanding. And one of the other papers that we had discussed possibly including in this episode was Dr. Lee's work looking at AI analyzing hand x-rays. And we only had time, and so it's hard to just pick only two presentations, but I'm so glad that you have the plug for AI. And it's just kind of indicative of the quality of research that we saw at this virtual meeting where so many papers are discussing such awesome advances that it was incredibly hard to choose just two. And I'm glad we got a plug in for that third one.
Good. I'm glad.
One question I had for you was I wanted to know what you do in your clinic and how you assess skeletal maturity and when you use extra tests like a hand x-ray and when you try to position the proximal humerus in there, and what's your protocol for skeletal maturity and scoliosis?
So the time that I'm really looking for assessing skeletal maturity is when I'm trying to make a decision. Is this a patient that is likely to progress to surgery that I need to consider bracing, or that is probably going to fail bracing and I need to consider surgery for them? Or is it somebody that I can say, look, you're scot-free, come back and see me in a year or two or sometime, if ever. So that's when I'm using it, is really to try to do that. And at this point, the only things that really seem to matter are if somebody is RISR 5 and you know they're completely grown and everything is all done. Otherwise, I end up getting a hand x-ray because it's got enough growth plates that I can really do some assessment on it. I'm working with Brian Smith right now. We have to get it a little bit off the ground, but we're trying to get through a number of the shoulder x-rays hopefully soon and give some more assessment on what's going on with the shoulder. I have not used that in my clinical practice yet, but there's no reason we couldn't. And I'm taking part in Michelle's work on the type 10 collagen. So really excited about the work that's happening there too.
That's great. So you're still getting a separate hand x-ray? You're not attempting to capture the hand in for free in a scoliosis x-ray in some way?
Well, it would be really nice. When I was in Rochester, the radiologist refused it because they wanted to bill separately for that. And now that I'm down here in Chapel Hill, we have the EOS machine. It's in a storage shed and has not been installed, so I still have no choice.
We've had similar struggles in our institution trying to get even the shoulder, let alone the hand, reliably pictured in our scoliosis x-rays. Awesome. I guess I had another couple of questions I wanted to ask you about your life in general, switching gears back away from skeletal maturity directly. I know you do a lot of international work, and that's a particular interest of mine too. We've both gone to Honduras a few times. So you have your fingers in a lot of different pies with your active research career, your leadership position at your institution, and also with the SRS. So how do you work international work in there, and how do you balance that with the rest of your career?
Yeah, it's been really hard, and I did not do a lot of it when my kids were growing up because it was a real challenge. And I think that that's something that young people who are in the academic world or are interested for any reason in doing international work is really balance it with the needs of your family, and you don't want to take away from that. So it wasn't really until my kids were older that I started doing that. I will tell you that coming down here to Chapel Hill with all of the challenges of a new job, it's been a challenge. And then COVID has nixed it out entirely for a while, but hopefully I can get going back. And I also think ideally it's a wonderful thing if we can get our residents involved with it. If you have a fellowship, if you can get the fellows involved with it, it's such an important part of our service. And you see people in all kinds of different circumstances, and you have to figure out how you're going to deal with less and still provide high quality care for people. So it's a wonderful challenge. It's a wonderful place to go and to be able to do things. It's also a wonderful training background for people who haven't seen the whole range of pathology that you see when you go to other places. But it's mostly just about these are our fellow human beings who need help too. And trying to inculcate that into the people that we're around is part of our goal in the end.
Great. Do you have any hobbies outside of orthopedics?
Oh, I like to fly fish. I like to hike. I like to bike ride. Yeah, all kinds of things like that.
That sounds great. All right. Well, I think those are the high points of what I wanted to talk about. Cynthia, do you have any other questions?
No, that was pretty much it. Thank you so much for taking the time to be part of our podcast episode. I'm really excited.
No, I really like that you guys are doing this. This is, as journals get to be more overwhelming and nobody can keep up with them anymore, the podcasts are kind of fun. And it's even for somebody who's further down their career than you guys are, it's a nice, easy way to catch up on things. I like it. Well, thank you guys very much. Look forward to seeing you in person at some point in one of the near meetings.
That'll be nice once we're back to that, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, folks, thank you for letting me join you tonight. I enjoyed this.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah. Have a good night.
Keep up the good stuff here.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Scoliosis Dialogues, and we hope that you will come back to join us for the next episode.
The Scoliosis Research Society is a nonprofit professional organization made up of physicians and allied health personnel. Their primary focus is on providing continuing medical education for healthcare professionals and on funding and supporting research in spinal deformities. Please visit srs.org for further information.